We are in the third week of a 6-week series that we're calling Old School. I don't know about you, but I love old school things. Apparently, I'm still deeply rooted in the 80s. Our senior pastor thinks cassette tapes are old school, but I've got a few years on him. So for me, when I go to my relaxing spot, I still listen to records. And I have a serious weakness for 80s soundtracks. My kids think I'm weird, but there's just something fun about the skipping and the dust and the imperfections of it. It takes me back to all those years ago. There's some old school things that just hold value years later, don't they? And that's the point of this series. That we're saying, we're asking the question, how do we thrive spiritually throughout our life? Not just this strange season, but how do we thrive spiritually? And there's some old school practices that we can get back to basics to help us do so. In the first two messages, Pastor Nate introduced the practices of abiding and fasting. This week, we're looking at the old school practice of neighboring. What does it mean when Jesus talks about neighboring? In Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37, there's this famous story that so many of us heard growing up. It's a popular one for Sunday school and children's stories. And because of that, maybe it's possible that we've gotten a little desensitized to it. That maybe we miss some of the intensity of what's actually going on in it. Let's start reading it together. In Luke chapter 10, verse 25, it says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Now, when it says expert in the law, we tend to think of a lawyer, a legal expert. But 2,000 years ago, an expert in the law was someone who was an expert in the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses, the Torah. They called them the law. So he wasn't a lawyer. This was a man who was a religious expert. So he says to Jesus, "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus did what he so often does. He flips it back to the man and he says, "What's written in the law?" He replied, "How do you read it?" And he looks at him and goes, "You're an expert. So you probably already have an opinion on this. So let's hear what it is." He answered in verse 27, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Now, when he says love your neighbor as yourself, he's actually quoting Leviticus 19:18. This was a law that they all knew, that they were all familiar with, and in theory were holding each other accountable to. And there's a lot more going on with this word neighbor than we might think at first glance. When I think neighbor, I think of the poor people that live on either side of my house full of teenage sons, right? But in this language, in Greek, this word neighbor actually had a much broader implication. When he used the word neighbor, he was thinking of the Jewish community, the Jewish people, that they as a group were his neighbors. And even though his view was bigger than what we might think it was at first glance, it was still limited. It still wasn't what God was calling us to, which is in some ways strange because from the beginning of the Old Testament, in the books of Moses, God talks about his promises and his love and his blessing being for all the world, not just his chosen people. The religious leaders and people in general, though, would have viewed this commandment, they understood this commandment as an inwardly focused directive, that they were to love their Jewish neighbor. Which means, as a conquered people, under the Roman government, most of the population of the known world would be considered non-neighbors to Jesus' audience that day. Which makes Jesus' answer fascinating, perhaps because he knew the expert wasn't ready to finish the conversation, he says in verse 28, "You've answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." Now, some have looked at this and said, so is Jesus saying that we can earn our salvation? We do these good things for our neighbors and we've checked off those boxes? And far from it. What Jesus is actually emphasizing is that if you are doing what this man has said, that you are loving the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, the natural result of that will be loving your neighbor. Jesus is driving home the point that if your heart has been transformed with God's love and his presence, then you cannot help but loving his children. What do I mean by that? You don't buy Eagles gear to become an Eagles fan, do you? You do it because you love the birds. You don't go to a Taylor Swift concert to become a Taylor Swift fan. You do it because you love Tay-Tay's music. I don't go to Star Trek conventions to become a Trekkie. I do it because I love the show. Yeah, 80s soundtracks aren't the only things I listen to. Our actions reflect the passions of our heart. And this is what Jesus is kind of driving home with this comment of, do this and you'll live. The expert hears this. In verse 29, it says, but he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? Do you see what's going on? Deep down, he knew his definition wasn't big enough. Deep down, he knew, however broadly he defined it, Jesus was going to do something different. That wasn't big enough. And he wanted that checklist. What he really wanted was for Jesus to lay out exactly who doesn't make the cut. Who are the non-neighbors? Who do I not need to love? At this point, Jesus tells a parable, a story he created to make a point. We're so far removed from this time and culture, though, it can be difficult for us to see just how incredibly politically, religiously, and racially charged this story actually was for his audience. It was shocking. It was offensive. This is Jesus in his mode where he's confronting religious leaders that are hypocrites and calling them names. This is the Jesus that flips tables in the temple, right? Buckle up. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. This road that he mentions, that was a real road, and it had a reputation for being the most dangerous stretch of road there was. This was the equivalent of going to the most dangerous part of town you can think of at midnight. That's what this road brought to people's mind. And so this man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, when he was attacked by robbers, they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road. And when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So to a Levite, this was another type of religious leader. So to a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Now, for the audience listening to Jesus that day, it was starting to get tense, right? Because these are the people that are supposed to be the heroes in the story. These are the ones they're supposed to look up to emulate. And they're not coming across too well, right? Jesus makes a point of saying they saw the man, and they went around the other way. And maybe they're even starting to squirm a little bit and making excuses. We make excuses for those above us that we want to respect, that we want to think the best of. And so maybe they were thinking, well, maybe they thought it looked like a trap. Maybe they were worried that they would become religiously unclean and unable to help others at the temple later. Maybe their avoiding him was actually serving a bigger cause. Whatever it was that was going on in their minds was immediately forgotten with Jesus' next words. But a Samaritan. The but is a loaded word, right? Because it means the story's about to change directions. Something different is going to happen with him. This is the hero. That's what the but says. That was a weird phrase. I'll just own that right now. But a Samaritan. This was shocking. This was outrageous. To the Jews, they viewed Samaritans, as offensive as it is to say it in this way. 2,000 years ago, they viewed Samaritans as half-breeds. They viewed them as traitors. They viewed them as religiously offensive because they didn't agree with their theology about God. Here's how much they didn't like Samaritans. Not only would they not talk or associate with Samaritans, if you needed to go on a journey 2,000 years ago, and the shortest way crossed through the Samaritan territory, they would go an alternate route that added a day or two to the journey to ensure that they would not breathe Samaritan air or touch Samaritan dust. It was political, it was racist, it was religious. The Samaritans checked all the non-neighbor boxes. It would be as though I were to make up the story today and set it in the most dangerous spot that you can think of, at the most dangerous time, deep in that troubled part of the city, in the middle of the night. And one of our church members had been jumped, beaten, robbed, left dying on the side of the road. And Pastor Todd came along. He saw him, locked eyes, went across to the other side of the road and kept going. It's shocking to hear. We don't picture this of Todd. And the poor church member laying on the ground dying is devastated. But then there's new hope, right? Pastor Nate comes along. They lock eyes. He thinks, oh, my pastor will surely help me. But Pastor Nate crosses the road and keeps going. It's devastating. But then Colin Kaepernick comes along and rushes to him and tends to his wounds and takes care of him and helps him up and puts him in his vehicle. He doesn't care about the blood getting wherever, but rushes him to the hospital and says, don't worry about his insurance, don't worry about his bills, I will cover it. I've got it taken care of. And let me know anything else that happens, any other costs that are incurred, that he would just go above and beyond. And some of you just got tense that I chose that name. Right? That it doesn't mesh with your view of the world. Let's spread that feeling around to make sure everyone can feel the awkwardness. What if the hero of the story was President Trump coming and caring for him? What if it was an Islamic religious leader? What if it was Jerry Falwell? What if it was a gay man that came and was the hero of the story? But then Tom Brady. Everyone here hates him. What do these names have in common? At their mention, we tend to jump into teams, don't we? That we hear the name, and depending what team we're on, whether it's with them or against them, it becomes polarizing, it becomes angry, it becomes heated. We have opinions, we have thoughts. Even when they do something right, it's hard to see it because we don't like that person. This is what was happening for the Jewish audience hearing this word Samaritan, but so much more so. So much more of a reaction. And so Jesus says to them, but a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was. And when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. This was medicine back then. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. The Samaritan went way beyond the minimum. He risked his own safety. He risked becoming religiously unclean. He took on tremendous financial sacrifice. We don't know for sure, But our best estimates is the money he gave the innkeeper was enough to pay all of the expenses for at least 2 to 3 weeks, possibly as much as 2 months. And there was a promise of anything more, let me know, I'll pay it. He went way beyond. Verse 36, Jesus says, "Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." Do you see the struggle here with who Jesus made the hero? The expert can't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. It's too hard to choke out this compliment of someone he has been trained to hate. But that's not even the point that we want to get at today. Did you catch what Jesus did? He pushed all the buttons, race, politics, religion, and then flipped the question. The expert wanted to know, who is my neighbor? The expert wanted to classify other people into 2 categories. Who falls into the my neighbor category and who falls into the non-neighbor category? And he was drawing the line out there, outside of himself. How do I classify others to determine who is worthy of my love? And Jesus asked the question, who is the neighbor? Do you see? It's subtle. But where the expert was putting it out there, Jesus makes it internal. Jesus is calling me not to look out and judge everyone else, but to judge myself. I'm the neighbor. I am called to be a neighbor to anyone I encounter. Instead of trying to classify others, I need to classify myself. Do you see the difference? Our inclination is to look out for ourselves. Number one, how does this impact me? In Oregon, I grew up on the West Coast, and in Oregon there's 3 mountains called the Three Sisters Mountains. And actually the one on the left here is called Charity. It's the tallest of the 3, 10,683 feet. That last 3 feet are important. When I was 12 or 13 years old, a group from my church climbed up there. My dad signed myself and my younger brother and himself up for it. And we made it to the top. You know, you look at me, you think, yeah, this is a guy that can hike 10,683 feet. I'm the cool kid right there. You can clearly see this is in the 80s. But anyways, we hiked. It was brutal. We were way over our heads on this hike. We were not ready for that. I mean, we had just bought our hiking boots. We broke them in on the mountain because we didn't know that's not something you want to do. It's not. And on the way down, we were starting to get low on water. And my younger brother ran out. And he says to me, Matthew, hey, Matthew, let me have some of your water. And I said, no, there won't be enough for me. And apparently this was the wrong answer because there were horrified looks from everyone. And my dad made some threats. And so I gave him some water, possibly a little reluctantly. But wasn't my reaction a little bit typical? I just vocalize it. Most of us keep it inside, and we play a lot nicer. How does this impact me? How does this impact my future? How does this impact my security, my safety? But in Jesus' economy, we're driven by a different set of values. Jesus calls us to go and do likewise. In Matthew 5:41, Jesus is talking about neighboring, and he says, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Now, to us, that doesn't make too much sense, but back then, as a conquered people under the Roman government, there was a law that said any Roman soldier could stop anyone and make them carry their load for 1 mile. It was insulting, it was humiliating, it was degrading, it was a constant reminder that you were a conquered people. For the Jews, it was religiously offensive because they considered themselves to be God's chosen people, called to be their own people, their own nation. And Jesus' words to them in the context of neighbor, because that's what he's talking about in Matthew 5 as well, is that, hey, when you're forced to go a mile, go a second mile. Effectively becoming 4 miles because they have to travel back. Jesus' response to a dangerous government conquering them was to submit and go farther than what was required. In Luke 8, Jesus heals a demon-possessed man, but in the process casts the demons into a nearby herd of 2,000 pigs that then throw themselves off a cliff and die. And I don't know if you took advantage. This past weekend, the Sight and Sound Theater made their Jesus production available for free to stream online. And I loved that scene in the movie. Because as they cast over, the miracle of this man's healing happens. The town people rush out, furious with Jesus. And they tell him, you have to go. You have to go. And one man laments, you've financially ruined us. 2,000 years later, we only remember them as the ones more concerned with their economy than the Savior and saving lives. In Matthew 25, Jesus tells a parable in which some are revealed to be saved and some are revealed to be destined to punishment. And when they asked him why the ones were saved who were saved, this was his answer in Matthew 25, verses 35 and 36. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. We worry about the temporary, don't we? We get so anxious about it. What about the economy? Who can we blame for this season? Are people worth the cost? Is the neighboring that Jesus is calling to us to worth the sacrifice? But Jesus calls us to be the neighbor. He calls us to go beyond what is required, to empathize with those who suffer in ways that we might not understand. To ask the question, how can I demonstrate God's love during this time? Do my choice or defense of words hurt my Chinese American brothers and sisters? What does my focus on money say to a friend whose mother just died in the hospital? If people overhear my conversations, my jokes, the things that I'm passionately talking about, will they be pointed to God or away? Do my impassioned posts online build walls or build bridges? You see, do my words and actions send the message that I am a neighbor, a person to reach out to? Or do they warn people off? Does the unmarried pregnant woman think the abortion clinic is safer to go to than to face judgment from me? Do my marginalized friends feel I'm someone who understands the injustices that happen to them? Or am I unsafe because I'm too distracted by the politics, by how it affects my income or my comfort? I love what Dr. Micah Edmondson, a pastor and author in Grand Rapids, wrote. He wrote, "You cannot love your neighbor while supporting or accepting systems that crush, exploit, and dehumanize them. You cannot love your neighbor while accepting less for them and their family than you do for you and your own." What does neighboring look like? It looks like loving God with all of our heart, our soul, our strength, and mind. And what does loving God with all of our heart, soul, strength, and mind look like? It looks like loving others the way Christ loves them. That he sacrificed everything for the sake of others' eternal soul. It means sacrifice. It means empathy. Instead of outrage, it means understanding. It means sacrificing at times my security whether it's financial or physical or safety, for the sake of others. It means being a neighbor to everyone, not just the ones I like, or that are on my team, or that agree with me. What is one way, large or small, that you could be a neighbor today? What is a step that you could take in the direction of being more like Christ in this area? This week, is it in person? Is it online? Is it with your family? With a stranger at the store? With a politician you disagree with? Is your schedule so packed that you don't have the margin to take the time and be a neighbor for someone else? What needs to be sacrificed to honor Christ in this area? In the book, The Art of Neighboring, the authors quote Brian Mavis, who said, "In this life, we can only do a few things really well. I think it's a good idea to make certain that one of those things is what Jesus says is most important." I don't know about you, but that really challenged me. Thinking in terms of that if there's only a few things I'm going to do well, isn't it important that they be the things Jesus has told us to do? Let's be known for being people who neighbor well. Let's be known as people who love God with all of our heart, soul, strength, and mind, and the way that just naturally reflects itself in our actions. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you for this parable. As challenging and as convicting as it can be, God, we ask that you would help us to be more and more like you. That you would draw us closer to you, and as we know you more and more, that our actions would reflect this kind of neighboring that you have called us to. Open our eyes to the opportunities we have around us to grow in this area. In your name, amen.